Hello. In this video today, I'll be explaining to you what a motherboard is and what RAM is in a computer. I'll tell you what are the differences between motherboards and RAM sticks, and how to choose a motherboard or RAM for your PC. Let's start off by talking about what the motherboard's role is in a PC, and then talking about how motherboards differ. Firstly, to understand what a motherboard does in a PC, think of the PC as a house, for example. The motherboard in this case would be the foundation of the house, where you build your bricks on top of, or your other components on top of. The motherboard hosts all the different types of connections for each of the components. There's a slot for a CPU, called the CPU socket. Then there are PCIe slots, which house graphics cards, if you have multiple or a single graphics card, and other PCIe add-in cards, for example, like a sound card. The motherboard also has connection points for power for stuff like the CPU, which uses either an 8-pin or a 4-pin connector for the power, and the actual slot for power for the actual motherboard itself, which is usually a 20-pin or a 24-pin connector. And finally, the motherboard also has connection points for stuff like hard drives and SSDs. They usually have 6 or more SATA ports where you can plug in SATA cables that connect to your drives and stuff like that. Some motherboards also have compatibility for a new type of interface called M.2. This is basically just another connection type for SSDs that goes directly into the motherboard with no added power cables or data cables involved. The main difference between motherboards is the size. The sizes can vary from ITX, the smallest, to micro ATX, then ATX, which is the standard size for most motherboards, and finally a much bigger size called eATX. Before purchasing a motherboard, I strongly suggest that you check the compatibility of your case and your motherboard. Because, for example, if you're buying a micro ATX sized case, and you have a eATX motherboard, the eATX motherboard just simply will not fit inside of the case because the motherboard will be too large and have the wrong standoff points for the motherboard. The next thing that you would need to check before purchasing a motherboard is the type of chipset that the motherboard uses. You will need to check if the chipset type is compatible with the CPU that you are purchasing. Because, for example, when Intel launched their 8th gen processors, the CPU itself used the same socket as the previous generations, the Skylake and Kaby Lake processors. However, these newer processors would not work on the previous chipset, the Z270 and Z170 chipsets. They could only work on Z370 chipsets. So you'll need to check if your CPU is compatible with the chipset of your motherboard. Now, there are other minor differences between motherboards. These include stuff like small features. For example, in some newer motherboards, there's this thing called a postcode readout. Now, what POST stands for is Power On Self-Test. It's basically a series of tests that the motherboard goes through before booting up to guarantee that the components are working and working properly in the PC. Now, what a postcode readout is basically it gives you a code that'll tell you exactly what part of the PC is not making it through the test before booting up. This will let you troubleshoot what is not working with your computer and make setting up your PC for the first time much easier and the troubleshooting much easier. Now, let's move on to talking about what RAM is in a PC. Firstly, RAM stands for Random Access Memory. But don't be fooled by the name. The memory in this case is something called volatile memory. That means that as soon as the power goes off in the PC, everything that's written on the drive will be completely erased because there would be no power to sustain what's written on the drive. So you might ask, what is RAM used for then? The answer to that question would be that RAM is basically very fast memory that the CPU uses to offload data from programs that it's currently using and running. Now that you know what RAM is and what it does, let's look at the 3 main differences between RAM sticks. The first main difference would be the generation of the RAM stick. There have been 4 generations of RAM that have come out. There's, first of all, DDR, then DDR2, DDR3, and DDR4. Nowadays, the standard for RAM is DDR4, as it's the latest and most and fastest version of RAM that there has ever been. And there's really no point in going back to the previous generations of RAM, as they're just simply slower than DDR4. The next main difference between RAM sticks is the capacity of each stick. Nowadays, you can find sticks that contain from anywhere from 2 gigs, 4 gigs, 8 gigs, 16 gigabytes, and 32 gigabytes of RAM, and even 64 gigabytes of RAM on a single stick. When choosing how much capacity you need in your RAM, I'd recommend firstly thinking about what are you going to use the PC for. If you're let's say if you're a video editor, having a lot of RAM is actually very useful, because when you have a big project, if you don't have a lot of RAM, your project will simply crash because of there's too much data that the CPU is using when editing a big project, that the program will really literally just crash if you have insufficient amounts of RAM. However, if you were just using your PC for gaming, then 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM should be plenty of RAM for all your needs. Let's now move on to talking about the last difference between RAM, and that would be the actual speed of the RAM stick itself. The speeds of the RAM can vary anywhere from 2400 megahertz to all the way to 4200 megahertz. And as the name implies, the speed of the RAM just dictates how fast the RAM is. The question whether it is worth it to go for faster RAM is a whole different topic. But I'd say that really there's no benefit of going anywhere higher than like 3500 megahertz. And that's really all you need to know about motherboards and RAM when purchasing one. So I thank you for watching this video. And if you want if you want to know anything else about PCs and such, I recommend you watch my other videos. Thank you for watching.